My name's Mike Kanakos. I'm a directory services engineer for MetLife. I've spent my entire career supporting Windows, clients, server, now Active Directory for the last 8 or 10 years, but you know, at the end of the day, I'm a sysadmin. A little bit about me, as I said, I work for MetLife. I also am pretty active in the PowerShell community here in the Raleigh area and in the greater United States. I'm the co-lead of the Research Triangle PowerShell user group. We meet here in Raleigh, in Cary, at MetLife. We meet twice a month. You guys are all welcome to come. You don't need to be a PowerShell expert to be part of our group. We're there to help people learn about PowerShell and how you can use it in your environment. So if you're interested in that, take a look at us. rtpsug.com is our website. You can get more information there. I'm also the community lead for PowerShell.org. I blog. I'm on Twitter way more than I should be. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. I'd love to talk to you. All the code that I write, I share in GitHub. This presentation will be out there, as well as others that I've done. I've also wrote a module called PSAD Health. There's an AD Health monitoring module for Active Directory. I wrote it with another person. We released it earlier this year. So I've done a lot of things, and I have to say that I love PowerShell, but I know that not everybody does, and it's not always accepted in all environments. So before we get started, I'm going to ask you guys some questions. How many people here are InfoSec people? Like straight up, InfoSec's my job. All right, are there any sysadmins here besides myself? All right, hey, that's my best friend over there. All right, so, hey, InfoSec people, let me use remoting, please. Please let me use it. It's great. I'm going to explain to you why you should not fear the Windows remote shell. But before we go into all that stuff, I would just be curious, of the people in this room, who trusts this client on their network? SSH. How many people feel comfortable letting people use SSH on their network to remote to other machines? Show of hands, honestly. All right, okay. What about remoting? Who feels comfortable running remoting on their network or letting their users run remoting on their network? And this is the problem that we have. Most people fear remoting. They fear it. I don't know exactly why. Maybe it's a Microsoft thing. Maybe because PowerShell is in the news and you hear all these attacks and they're always leveraging PowerShell. And they're using PowerShell to move laterally through the network. So, you know, what ends up happening is PowerShell remoting is not accepted in the environment. So I want to ask people, why is that? Why are we afraid of a client that has the same feature parity as SSH? And that's what I want to talk about today. And hopefully at the end of this talk, you guys will feel a little more confident about letting your users run PowerShell remoting in your environment. So listen, it's 2020 almost. The world has changed in the last 5 or 7 years. I don't know that I would have ever thought that I'd be standing up in front of a group of people and say that Microsoft loves Linux, right? So that's not something we've always heard. Everybody says we got to be doing DevOps now, right? That's the new hotness, CI/CD pipelines, constant change, fail fast, all this iterative stuff. And you know, at Microsoft, the command line is cool again. It's PowerShell, all the things. That's PowerShell first, GUI second. But the bottom line is, at the end of the day, all of us have more VMs today than we had 5 years ago. But now those VMs, they don't exist just in our data center. They exist in every site in our network, in every cloud, across the country. I mean, in our, you know, this country, other countries, in the Microsoft cloud, AWS cloud, GCP. The bottom line is, we have more machines to manage. As I say, the world has changed. We have to change with the way we manage those machines. And that really is about PowerShell remoting. So if you've never seen Server 2016 Core, this is what it looks like. Now, this is a remote desktop session into Server 2016. I am not advocating that you RDP into Server 2016 Core machines. But if you were to RDP into a server core machine, that's what you get. There is no GUI. You get a command line. So as Microsoft marches more towards this world, we have to figure out how to be able to work in this environment, for your point of view, securely, to let admins do their work and you feel comfortable, you're able to sleep at night, that you're not letting them do something that is putting your network at risk. Because this is the future of Microsoft OS. There's always going to be a GUI. but less and less it's a GUI-driven world. So I'm hoping this is not your org, but this has happened to me. I have asked, I'd like to enable remoting in my environment, and I was shut down immediately. Why? Because the security pros at my place heard on the news that PowerShell was scary, was used in a lot of attacks, and from their standpoint, they assume all the risk. So they didn't know, so they said no. Now, I was lucky enough to have a security leader that said, look, I think you know what you're doing, and I'm going to let you go out and do the research. And if you could prove to me that this is safe, we'll talk about it. And that's really how I got started with all these talks. So I have no problem if anybody in this room wants to shut off PowerShell remoting in their environment, as long as you have a reason why that makes sense and not, it's in the news and it's bad and I think we shouldn't turn it on. So this is going to be mostly foundational knowledge, and the idea here is that when you leave today, you'll have a better understanding of the things that you can use to secure PowerShell and remoting and make you feel more comfortable about using in your environment. So with that, we level set. What is PowerShell remoting? So connecting to a remote computer via Windows remoting. Now you say, hey Mike, that's like so obvious. We're remoting, I want to connect to a remote machine. That's not obvious, because if you're not doing it with Windows remoting, you're not PowerShell remoting. And I'm going to explain that in a second. And that's the key. PowerShell remoting is different than other remoting techniques you may have used in the past. And that's what I want to talk about today. So, if you're using PowerShell, you're using remoting when you're using any commandlets that start with sim, PS session, or invoke command. If you're not using those commandlets, you're not doing remoting. How does remoting work? Remoting uses the Windows Remote Management Service. It's on all modern computers, Windows 8, Windows 10, Server 2012, Server 2016, Server 2019. Windows Remote Service runs on your machine. It leverages the WSMAN protocol. WSMAN stands for Web Services for Management Protocol, and that's using HTTP and HTTPS, 5985, 5986. And I will guarantee you that over the next 2 years, as you work with remoting more, 5985 and 5986 will become well-known ports like DNS, SSH, any of the other well-known ports that we all work with all the time. You're going to know 5985 and 5986. TCP. What you may not know out of the box, without you doing anything, all PowerShell remoting connections are encrypted by default. So why do we want to use PowerShell remoting? So this is not like, why do I want to use it in an environment? We understand that we need to use remoting to connect to remote machines. What are the features about remoting that makes it advantageous? First off, it's built to work with Active Directory. Out of the box, you have to do nothing to configure it to work with Active Directory. It relies on Kerberos authentication to authenticate users. So if you're comfortable using Control-Alt-Delete to authenticate users in your Windows domain, then you should be comfortable using PowerShell remoting to authenticate users on remote machines. As I said, all connections are encrypted and it's firewall aware. Not out of the box, but you can configure robust logging. You can configure so much logging that you will know every command that's run in your environment. You can leverage Gaea profiles, and if you've never heard of Gaea, it stands for Just Enough Administration, and you can think of it as role-based access for PowerShell. And I'll talk about that later. It supports certificates. So I talked about Kerberos authenticating users. Certificates is going to confirm that the computers are who they are. And believe it or not, when we talk about remoting and connecting to other machines and accessing machines on the network, it's more secure than anything else Microsoft has released to date. So you want to be using this. This is a secure platform for you to access remote machines. I talked about commandlets. These commandlets on the screen are the ones that use PowerShell remoting. The ones in yellow are most likely the ones that you will start with when you're doing remoting. So I mentioned PS session. Anytime I want to enter a session, I'm using enter PS session. That's a remote, that's an interactive remote session. Get PS session, new PS session, connect, sim sessions, and invoke command. Probably the most popular remoting command there is. That's what I want to use if I want to run commands against a wide range of computers at one time. How does remoting actually work? So I'm going to show you a little diagram here. This is two computers. It's a 4-part process. Look, this is not the only 4 pieces involved, but this is the parts that you need to know if you want to understand how remoting works. So it starts with our local PowerShell session. It's authenticated. How is it authenticated? You Control-Alt-Delete it into the machine. We know who you are. When you launch PowerShell, that's running as you. If you right-click PowerShell and you say run as another user, you're authenticated. Now we're running as another user. If you're running commands that support the credential parameter, you're authenticated again. So all times that we're using PowerShell, we are authenticated. We know who the user is. When we want to connect to a remote machine and when we use one of those commandlets that I just showed on the previous screen that support remoting, what happens behind the scenes is I will connect to the remote computer, and the first thing that will happen is I will be authenticated. And it's standard Microsoft Windows security. My group my group membership is looked up on the remote machine. I figure out what access I have on the remote machine, and then a session is created. This diagram makes this look like a VPN tunnel. That's not true. This is a session. It's running over 5985 and 5986. And as I said, everything encrypted by default. So what happens? I type some commands on my local computer. They're sent over to the remote computer. They're processed. And then eventually, they're going to be sent back to the local machine. So when you're doing remoting, you're not doing the work on your machine. It's basically a remote shell. And the work is being performed on the remote computer, and the results are being sent back to me. Now, if I'm connecting to 1 machine or 100 machines, the process is exactly the same. I create sessions to those machines. I perform my commands. The session sends the information over to the remote machine, and that information is transferred back. Me, as the end user, I don't need to manage any of that. All I need to do is use a command that's remoting aware, put some credentials in, and off I go. PowerShell handles this all behind the scenes with something called run spaces. You don't need to do anything with run spaces, but just know that run spaces is the tool that manages all the session connections behind the scenes, and when the data comes back, it reassembles all the data and allows you to be able to tell what data came from what machine. So this chart here is a little confusing. I apologize. The only way I can get this to fit on the screen is to remove all the titles and everything. What you're looking at here is a chart from MITRE.org. It's the attack matrix for Windows. These are all the things that an attacker could try to leverage to pop a machine, connect to it, whatever you want to call it, okay? There's a lot of ways that an attacker can attack a machine, but we're not done. We have more and more. These are all the ways that an attacker can try to connect to a machine. I'm going to zoom this out. Now, I understand that this is not readable, but you could see 3 yellow boxes on this screen, okay? If you're an InfoSec professional and you say that I'm going to make my environment more secure by shutting off PowerShell, those 3 yellow boxes are PowerShell. So you didn't secure anything. You still have all these other methods for someone to attack your machine. However, if you remember in an earlier slide, I said that PowerShell is the most secure thing that Microsoft has given us for connecting between machines ever. So now, from an InfoSec standpoint, when I shut off PowerShell and I force someone to attack me with another method, I lose visibility. Does anybody have any great tools for logging every command that happens in an RDP session? Batch scripts, PSExec, any of that stuff? No. You have all of that in PowerShell. So what ends up happening is when you take the stance that I'm going to shut off PowerShell remoting because I hear that it's being leveraged for malware attacks, you're actually making yourself less secure because you're giving yourself less visibility in the next attack. Now, I am not advocating that people wait for an attack, but when you talk to your InfoSec leaders, your executive management, we all say the same thing. I need to buy products to protect my network, but understand I can never protect against anything, against everything, excuse me. But when I do get attacked, I want to know what happens. So this is why I need product X or product Y. When you shut off PowerShell, you're taking away that visibility. So you want to embrace the idea of running PowerShell, force your users into PowerShell and remoting and away from RDP and away from batch scripts and away from WMI and away from all those other methods that we've been using all those years to connect to remote machines. So this is just another slide to represent exactly what I just talked about. This is a slide a friend of mine showed at a recent conference, and I really liked it. An attacker comes right down the middle here. So what do? We shut off PowerShell and we put up a roadblock. And what do? They go right around that roadblock. The problem is when they go around the roadblock, do you know what they did when they used the other tool? And in many cases, you don't. Your job as InfoSec professionals is to be able to understand what happened, retrace the steps, and figure out what's going on. When you shut off PowerShell Remoting, you take a lot of those tools away from you. So, sure.
But earlier you said logging is not enabled by default.
Correct. So we're going to talk about how to turn it on. It's very simple. So the foreshadow here is that everything that you want to do in PowerShell, you can enable with group policy.
And then I also heard that the earlier versions of PowerShell, like 1, 2, and like, don't have those logging commands.
And
even if logging is enabled, if the attacker uses 2.0, it's not going to get logged.
so you are correct. However, let's talk about reality. So PowerShell is on version 7. All right? PowerShell gets real at version 3, gets really good at version 5. Version 5 is what's running on Windows 10. Version 4 is what's running on 2012. You can upgrade all these versions through .NET upgrades. If anybody is running PowerShell 1 or 2, you gotta get with the times. Honestly, you're not doing yourselves any favors by trying to use a modern technology with the oldest versions available. You can bring those older versions available, but when you're saying you're using PowerShell 1 or PowerShell 2 or even PowerShell 3, what you're really saying is I have to support old OSs. Because no one says, I want to use PowerShell 2. That's really awesome. It's, I'm stuck with PowerShell 2 because I have an old OS. So what I would do is I would say, in that situation, you want to segregate that environment as much as possible. Maybe that's not the best use of PowerShell, right? But let's talk about for our more modern computers how we can do that logging so that you can feel comfortable and you can know what's going on. But before we get to all of that stuff, we need to understand what's happening when we remote. And I call this the road to a remote computer. And what we're going to show here is any random network, a bunch of computers on a network that have some sort of security and are interconnected, okay? What kind of network doesn't matter. You want to say Ethernet, that's great. Those green locks represent the security of the end node. And for our example, we're going to say that that security is super locked down. So locked down that nobody can connect to anybody, okay? Let's take that and reverse that. And let's lighten up the security totally. Now, anybody can make a connection anywhere. I want to ask you guys, what has changed with remoting? And the answer is nothing. What changed is the security on our end nodes. And that's the misnomer that everybody has with remoting. Remoting, oh my God, remoting's insecure. The security is in your end nodes. Remoting is the path to get there. And what happens when you get there? It's not the security vector that you think it is. Now, is there encryption? Yes. Is there authentication? Yes. Is there logging? Yes. But those are all tools to help you figure out what's going on between systems. The security that you need to be concerned about is your end nodes. When I get to a machine and I knock on the door, what happens? And I'll give you an example of that. Well, let's go back for a second. Tomorrow, you guys may be watching some football. Maybe you'll go over someone's house, okay? How are you going to get there? You're going to jump in the car, get on the road, go to their house. When you get there, you're going to knock on the door. When they see who you are, if you're trusted, they know who you are, they're going to let you into the house. The road only got you there. The security was when I knocked on the door and I had to figure out who was at the door. So remember, remoting is not the fear. Remoting is the vehicle to get us to these places. You have to concentrate your efforts on your security on your end nodes. If you have a help desk that's local admins on all client PCs, you do not want remoting in your environment. Not because of remoting, but because there's no security in place. Same thing, 50 domain admins in your environment, maybe you don't want to be using remoting. But if you have good end node security in place, turning on remoting and the controls that come with it is not your fear. I talked about authentication a little bit. Just to review, you have to be using certain commandlets to be using remoting. Any of the PS session commandlets, any of the SIM commandlets, invoke command. When you use those commandlets, you're going to start a session to another machine. Behind the scenes, you're going to connect to that remote machine. You're going to be authenticated. Based on your group membership on the remote machine is going to determine your level of access. As I said, remoting, designed to work with Active Directory out of the box. You don't have to do anything. As a matter of fact, remoting is on in all your environments today, unless you specifically shut it off. The Windows Remote Management Service is running on Windows 8, Windows 10, 2012, 2016 by default. Unless you turn that off, remoting is on right now in your environments. Authentication occurs via Kerberos, and as I said earlier, if you're comfortable with people Control-Alt-Delete in the morning and authenticating on your network, then you should be comfortable doing it via remoting. It's the same basic process. So what happens when we get to a remote machine? Standard Windows stuff here. Remoting is for admins. It's not for Mary in accounting. It's not for Joe in marketing, and certainly not for the facilities guys. It's for admins who need to connect and control and modify remote systems. So it's assumed that when someone connects to a machine that has administrative access, that they are given administrative access in PowerShell. If you don't want them to have remote administrative access, we have this group remote management users, and it works exactly the same way as RDP works. We all understand RDP. I want to remote to a machine and I'm an admin, I'm allowed to RDP. If I'm not an admin and I want to RDP to a machine, we stick them in remote desktop users and we give them read access to the machine. Everybody knows that today. It's the same exact concept in remoting. And you can see it clearly says here, WMI resources over WS management, Windows remote management. So this is clearly for remoting. Nobody is going to waste their time putting people in the local remote managers group by hand. You're going to do it via group policy. And as I said, everything that you can do with PowerShell, you can configure with group policy. So this slide here is just simply saying that if you want to turn on remoting in your environment, there's 3 pieces. You have to enable the service. It's on by default, but if you need to force it on, you need to set it to auto start. And then you need to poke a hole through your client firewall to allow those 2 ports to come back and forth. This slide is showing us where we enable the service. Now that's not what I really wanted to show here. What I really want to highlight here is this IP4 filtering, IP6 filtering. I'm going to come back to that in 2 slides, but I want you to think about that for a second, because from this point forward, everything that you heard is foundational stuff. It's just turn it on, turn it off. How does authentication work? Now we're going to move into how do I dial down group remoting for my environment so that I feel super confident. I told you there's a firewall rule that you can enable. Microsoft makes it dead simple. It's built in. All you have to do is enable the rule. I'm assuming that most people in this room are comfortable with group policy. Using group policy, you can deploy this at a domain level, OU level, by group, lots of different options. And it's the stuff we've been doing in Windows networks for years. So let's come back to that IP filtering for a second. And to understand this, I need to give you an example that helps illustrate the point here. So let's imagine we manage a computer network of 500 computers. In those 500 computers, in that network of 500 computers, we have 30 admins. We could make the case very easily that the 470 machines that are not my administrators, they have no business ever starting a PowerShell remoting session. I may want to connect to those machines, but Mary in accounting should not be remoting to someone else's machine. That's not in the purview of her job. So if I could shut off remoting for the 470 machines, That's a super simple way to secure my network. And that's what IP filtering allows us to do. And let me explain. So this is a policy that you can configure and push to your clients. And in that IP filtering box, you can configure some interesting options. So let's maybe assume that we have an admin VLAN in our network. And all our admin machines run on an admin VLAN. I could put the admin VLAN in here. And when that gets pushed out to my clients, what that means is I'm a client and I have the setting in there, and I'm only going to accept connections from the admin VLAN. So now I have 500 computers, and I said only those 30 computers on the admin VLAN can connect. We do some quick math. I just limited the amount of machines that can connect to my machine by 94%. 30 out of 500 can start connections. Not who can receive connections, but those are the ones that will start a connection and will actually be connected when they get to the remote side. Now, maybe you don't have an admin VLAN. Maybe you could put in individual IPs here. That's kind of gross, but there's other options you could do, right? I'm not recommending you do that, but if that's the choices you have, you do it. Another option is maybe you work in a tiered environment. My clients shouldn't be connecting anywhere with these kinds of tools. I want to force the people that are doing remoting to servers or to jump boxes, tool servers, right? Those servers don't have connected access to the internet, so those machines are a little bit more secure than my client machines. I could put, let's say in my 500 computer network, I have 5 tool servers. If I put the IP addresses of those 5 tool servers in there, now what I'm saying is I push that setting out to all my clients, and my clients are now configured to only accept connections from 5 tool servers. And on those 5 tool servers, remember from previous slides, you need to be authenticated, you need to be an admin or in a remote management users group. So do some quick math, 5 computers out of 500. I've now skinny down my environment to 1% of my computers can actually start a PowerShell session on a remote computer. So a little summary here. If you want to turn on remoting in your environment, you need to think about, you need to enable services, configure a firewall exception, decide who gets access, and then you need to start thinking about where connections can be initiated from. Last but not least, you need to figure out how you're going to configure all that stuff. Me, I'm a Windows sysadmin. Group policy is my tool of choice. You certainly can do this with PowerShell commands, and you certainly can connect to each machine and configure them on an individual basis. But for most of us, group policy makes the most sense. I want to take a breather here. Hey, what can I help you with?
So that question last, basically you're creating a whitelist in GPO.
Yes.
So using the next speaker's talk, if I were to compromise a machine, read the GPO, discover the policy, it says, oh, these 5 systems are able to connect to these high-value targets, then those become my targets then.
So what we're gonna get into next is talking about Gaea. And I'm going to do it quick because understand that I could spend all the time in this talk talking about the foundational stuff that we just talked about. I could spend the next 5 sessions talking about Gaea. It's a pretty big topic that has a lot of options. I really just want to highlight what you can do with it, and then I think the question that you were asking will sort of answer itself. Is there any other questions about anything I talked about so far? Hey, John.
Hey, so I just want to add one quick thing.
Yeah.
About that prior question about 2.0. Also in group policy, you can turn off that 2.0 compatibility engine.
So that's a good point. I certainly did not mention that. The question was, in case you didn't hear it, earlier we asked about what do I do for older versions of PowerShell, and John, who's a Microsoft PFE, a friend of mine, and he spoke at my conference earlier this year. John is highlighting that you don't have to run with PowerShell 1 or 2. You can shut that off via group policy. Those PowerShell engines are not able to be run in your environment. So what I'm talking about is probably the bare basics of remoting. Remember, we have lots of tools to lock our environment down, and Microsoft gives us a lot of options. And it's actually something we talked about last night, how this culture of adding on third-party tools to existing products makes us more safer in our minds, when actually we haven't leveraged all the tools that are available in the base products already. So this is a perfect example. I didn't even think about shutting off one or two in my environment via group policy, but that's an excellent option. All right, so just enough administration, also known as Gaea, is a big topic to digest. I'm just going to do a very light overview. So, oh, wow, red is really hard to read here. I'll read these to you guys just in case you can't see. Gaea is the equivalent of role-based access for PowerShell. All right? You create two kinds of files when you're configuring Gaea. One is called a role capability file. That's the thing that's going to say, this is my roles that I'm defining. And I'll skip ahead so they're easy to read. And then you create session config files, and this is what would be similar to your ACLs. So I have one file that says, here's who can connect to my machine, and I have another file that says, when they get there, this is what they can do. Now, what they can do when they get there is probably the part that everybody here in this room is missing out on when I'm explaining this. Because when I say what they can do when they get there, we're talking strictly about remoting. So I, as an administrator, when I configure Gaea and I say this is what Joe, the Exchange admin, can do when he connects to his Exchange server, and maybe Exchange server is a bad example, but Help Desk wants to connect to the file server to administer shares via PowerShell Remoting. Well, you know what? I'm not so comfortable with that. I want to limit that Help Desk user to run 5 commands, regardless of his access on the box. He could be an admin on the box. I don't care. When you connect with Gaea, you're going to get these 5 commands that I configured. That role capability file defines that, and the session config file is where I defined who that applies to. I can deploy that via group policy, and the combination of creating roles and ACL lists allows me to lock down my environment much tighter than my default configs that we talked about just 10 minutes ago. So here's an example of that. Over here, I have a couple of session config files. This is who can connect. Over here is roles, what commandlets can be run, and I deploy that to my environment, and now I have custom configs for my machines. So now I'm saying, hey, Joe, you're an admin on this box in Windows, but when you connect via PowerShell Remoting that has Gaea enabled, and you connect to my endpoint, you're no longer an admin. You are whatever I say you are. So now think about a few slides ago. We limited our connections with IP filtering. We have encrypted connections. We're authenticating each user. And now when they get there, we're limiting what they can do. So think about the footprint that we've created for our environment from, oh my God, PowerShell Remoting is bad, and it's being used to exploit everything in the world, to you can only connect from a couple of boxes, you have to have authentication, I'm going to lock down what you can do, and I control those sessions. You can't talk about anything with PowerShell Remoting from an InfoSec standpoint without logging. Now look, you don't need to log anything, but I think that's pretty much crazy. We log because we want to know what's happening. Sometimes we log because we want to know what happens after the fact. So PowerShell gives us 3 options for doing that. How am I doing on time? Okay. Module logging, script block logging, and transcription. They all work a little bit differently. I'm going to go over them very lightly, but these are the tools that you use to log activity in your environment. So the first one we're going to talk about is module logging, and what the purpose of module logging is if you're using PowerShell today, you're probably familiar with the concept of modules. Maybe you've written a module, but if you haven't, you all have used a module. If you manage Active Directory, you're using the Active Directory module. If you connect to SQL, you're using a SQL module, so forth and so on. This is configuring logging for a specific module to say anytime a command is run from that module, I'm going to log the activity. So in this example here, someone is running the get SMB share command, and I can see here that the get SMB share command was logged, and I can see who ran it, and then we have our standard Windows stuff, time and information, and all that good stuff. What I don't see here, though, is the commands the output of the commands. I just see somebody ran this command. It's useful, but it's probably the one that people aren't going to reach for first. I will say, with all these logging options, you need to be comfortable with the idea of having big logs, because PowerShell and all the tools that come with it can produce a lot of logs. Like, I'm talking about a minimum of 1 gig, probably upwards of 2 or 4 gig for the logs that hold these logs. Module logging and script block logging, which I'm going to talk about next, write to the event logs. So we want to build our event logs to be able to keep enough capacity to go back and look what had happened when we need it. Now, if you have a SIM in your environment and you could sweep logs off, obviously this becomes a lot easier. But if you don't have a SIM, it doesn't mean that you don't have choices. You can make big log collections, and you can have, a period of time that you want to be able to go back and look at and still be able to see what is happening in your environment. Script block logging is more of the general catch-all thing. If you ever ran invoke command, you type invoke command, computer name, dash script block, curly braces, it's going to log whatever in that script block. Any script that you ever run, the body of the script is the script block. So we're basically saying I want to log all my activity. And here's the interesting thing about script block logging. You guys all have this on in your environment today. You don't know it. You just don't have it on at its full capability. So we talked earlier in one of the sessions about all that data that Microsoft ingests every day. They use AI, and they're able to figure out patterns and techniques that are happening in the world that are probably known bad techniques. There are patterns of code that are used by malware writers, script kiddies, whatever you want to call them, that we just wouldn't use. Microsoft has already turned on logging of that malicious code in your environment, whether you know it or not. So when you go back to the office and you want to check these event IDs, if you're seeing some activity, you got to roll up your sleeves. You got some work to do, because something is happening in your environment that's causing that to be logged. So when we turn on script block logging, we're turning on logging for everything else. And this is going to produce a lot of logs, because, as I said, script block logging is basically everything. And when I say everything, we need to think about this for a second, because we're all thinking about users running commands. But pretty much every Microsoft product now also runs PowerShell in the background. And when you turn on logging, all that activity is going to get captured as well. And that's why I say you need to have big log files to account for all that activity. When you turn on logging, this is what you, script block logging, this is what you get. Here's a script block that ran the get Windows feature commandlet. It was ran in this script called test.ps1, standard, who ran it, the time, and all that good stuff. When you run a script, sometimes scripts can be 2, 3, 4, 500 lines of code. There's a limit to what can be captured in these event logs, so Microsoft will break up those logs over multiple events. So sometimes you need to look at multiple logs to put all this information together. Transcription is different than the other 2 logs that we talked about already, because this is going to produce flat text files. So some of you may have used transcription already in your environment without realizing it. If you've ever opened up PowerShell and you ran the command start transcript, and then you typed a bunch of commands, and at the end you typed stop transcript, that's transcription. And what that does is you're basically recording your work. So if you know you're going to be running some interactive commands and you want to save them for later, you can say start transcript, put in a setting for where that log is going to go, start running all your commands, stop transcript. That will be flushed out to a log file that you can then open and review. Turning on transcription is the group policy version of what I just said. I turn on transcription. I'm basically saying I want to log the activity that everybody does on whatever machines I configure that for. And that's going to produce flat log files. Now, you might say to yourself, Why would I want this? I'm going to show you in a second about transcription being different than the other two options. But also remember, if you don't have a SIM and you're worried about managing these huge event logs and having them roll over, this is an alternative that may work for you, because these are going to be flat text files and you can save them off to wherever you want. And another thing to consider, when we talk about logging events, if you don't leave enough room to capture enough data for you to be able to go back and look at whatever time period you need to look at, you might as well not turn on logging at all. Because logging is going to have an overhead on your machine. It's going to chew up disk space. It's going to cause CPU usage. It's going to burn some memory. And if you configure logging to be too short, and then you go back 2 days later and you want to go look at what happened, and it's not there because the logs rolled over, why turn on logging at all? So that's why I say, when you think about logging, you need to think about the range of data that you want to look at and where you're going to store it. When we were talking about the first two options, it's going to be event log. Now when we get to transcription, I can put this in flat log files, and now I can start to move them around to where I want. A little bit of warning here. We're saving what's typed at the command line. So we are going to capture things that we may not think about should be in log files. Now, if you use the 5 minutes, good. If you use the standard stuff that Microsoft gives you for inputting passwords, get credentials, secure string, those passwords are not going to be saved to your logs. But if you're typing in API keys, connect strings, that kind of stuff, that will be captured to your logs, so you want to think about securing this. This is what a transcript log looks like. I can see here who ran this. I can see when it started. But look, this is the first time that I actually see the exact output of what was shown in the console. That did not exist in script block logging and module logging. So the point being is transcription offers you an option that's not available with the others. You want to do logging? It's very simple. You need to think, there's 3 different logging options. As I said, 2 right to the event logs. 1 produces flat text files. Keep in mind, the logs are going to fill up quick, but I will tell you that the right combination of logging depends on your organization. There is no right way to do it. Most of the InfoSec guys that I've talked to want script block logging on by default. You have to figure out what's right for you. I only have a few minutes left. I just want to see if there's any questions about that. All right, so we'll move on real quick. Sure, what can I help you with?
I've been reading a lot more about people are talking about tools like this trying to replace VPNs, like IPsec VPNs. Do you see it as supplementing or just replacement?
I feel like those are 2 different technologies. Remoting is a way to move data back and forth between machines to do admin functions. VPN is about how to extend networks for people who need to connect in outside the corporate office, right? So those can be the same or different things, right? For your admin who needs to connect, they're going to use remoting. But you want them to get on the network first in a secure way. So my company, it's establish a VPN tunnel to work, and then I can open up a command prompt on my machine. But what more commonly happens is VPN tunnel, connect to the network, remote into a tools server, and run PowerShell from that tools server so that my client that I'm working on sitting in Starbucks can't be compromised and I have a way in, right? So, quick summary here. Why do we want to use remoting? The combination of encryption, trusted authentication, IP filtering, role-based access, and logging options, along with good end node security, is going to help you guys sleep better at night. So with that, I want to say thank you. I have one question here in the back.
Just from the troublemaker, have you used any PowerShell web access? Any of you played with that?
So when you say web access, you mean invoke web requests, those kinds of things?
It's something that came up from Microsoft a couple years back. And basically, you fire up an HTTP server at 443, and it does a PowerShell remote session right in the browser.
I haven't personally done that. I bet you John could talk about that.
Yeah, I've got it on my phone.
Yeah. So there you go. So if you guys don't know who I'm talking about here, this gentleman here in the front, John Fox, is a Microsoft employee. reach out to him in between the sessions. I'm sure he could talk about that. I unfortunately don't have any experience with that. Thank you guys for your time today. Oh, I'm sorry, another question back here.
Yeah, is that like additional cost, or is that just built in?
No.
And is it a certain version of PowerShell?
I think it's definitely 3 and above, but 5 and above.
Five's got the full kit, yeah.
5 has the full set. So basically, Windows 10, Windows 2016 are your friend, right? Server 2012 is close because that's PowerShell 4. But remember, we can add on and upgrade the PowerShell versions on existing machines. So it's not like, oh my God, 2012, I'm stuck. Now, that may mean you may not want to put .NET Framework on all these machines, but that's something else to consider. But it's there for you to use. So thank you again, guys. Enjoy your day.